In the quiet hills of Kentucky, where mist clings to the valleys and the crows never stop crying, there stands a mansion the locals still whisper about, the Ravenscroft estate. Its windows have been boarded up for nearly 2 centuries, yet sometimes they say candlelight flickers behind the cracks and the sound of girls laughing drifts through the pines. The story of the Ravenscroft family is one of unnatural births, eerie coincidences, and a secret that defies all explanation. This isn't just another tale of a haunted house. It's a mystery carved into bloodlines and marked by the ticking of fate itself. The year was 1847, and the air in rural Kentucky carried the heavy scent of rain and soil, a land still raw and wild. The Ravenscroft estate stood tall on the edge of the Cumberland woods, its iron gates wrapped in ivy, and its windows darkened as though the house itself refused to let light in. It was on this land, one fateful night in early October, that the cries of another Ravenscroft child echoed through the hallways. A 7th daughter, born under the same black sky at the same hour, and on the same date as the 6 before her. The midwife, a trembling woman named Agatha Crow, would later swear the clock in the drawing room stopped the instant the infant took her first breath. It had happened with every child, and no matter how many times the family replaced the clock, it always froze at the stroke of 1. The storm outside raged like a living thing, tearing through the trees, shaking the shutters, and splintering lightning across the fields. But inside the great house, Eleanor Ravenscroft's voice stayed calm as ever. Her skin glistened with sweat, but her eyes were distant, unblinking, as though she knew exactly what the hour demanded of her. The doctor refused to return after the 3rd birth, claiming he had seen too much of something not human in the newborn's eyes. Every time a daughter came into the world, her first cry was not a wail but a low hum, the same haunting tone that filled the air like a vibrating chord. The servants crossed themselves, whispering that the family had called upon something beyond mortal understanding, something that had granted them daughters identical in face, in voice, in soul. By the time the 7th was born, not a single villager dared come near the estate. It was said that when the 7th cry filled the air, the storm outside stopped mid-thunder, leaving an unnatural silence over the land, a silence so thick it pressed against the walls. Even the horses in the stable reared and struck the doors with their hooves, their eyes rolling white with terror. Lord Alistair Ravenscroft, the patriarch of the family, was not a man of superstition. He had built his wealth from the soil, from tobacco fields that stretched beyond sight, but the crops had begun to wither the year his first daughter was born. He dismissed the signs at first, calling them coincidence, but when his livestock died without cause, when the river beside their land turned the color of rust, he began to look at his wife with something that wasn't love. Eleanor had changed after the first birth. Her hair remained dark as ink while other women her age grayed, her skin pale but unlined, and her eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight. There were nights when Alistair would wake to find her standing at the nursery window, all 6 daughters asleep behind her, whispering words he could not understand. He claimed to have seen shapes moving in the fields, tall and bent, like shadows trying to take form. When the 7th daughter was laid in Eleanor's arms, she smiled faintly, not with joy but with relief, as though a long task had finally been completed. The baby's eyes opened wide, the same pale blue as her sister's, and all 7 girls shared the same mark beneath the left collarbone, a faint crescent that shimmered faintly under candlelight. The midwife saw it and fled before dawn, muttering that no family should bear such repetition, that no womb should birth the same child 7 times over. But in the days that followed, it became clear the daughters were not merely alike in looks. They moved the same, laughed the same, even turned their heads in unison when spoken to, as if guided by a single thought. Visitors found it unbearable to stay long in their presence. The way the girls' gazes followed one another with unnatural precision gave the impression of one soul stretched thin across 7 bodies. Rumors spread through the nearby town of Ravens Hollow. The church bells refused to ring properly, their tone dull and broken. A priest was summoned to bless the Ravenscroft home, but he left before sunset, pale and trembling, saying the Lord's name did not hold sway within those walls. Locals spoke of curses, of old pacts made with the forest spirits long before the land was tamed. Some said Eleanor Ravenscroft's mother had been a witch from Virginia, burned for consorting with dark entities. Others whispered that Alistair had sought power and fortune through forbidden rites, trading something sacred for endless prosperity, but the promise had twisted, and instead of sons to carry the name, he was given daughters bound by the same birth, the same breath, the same doom. The Ravenscroft mansion grew colder each year. Servants left without warning, claiming to hear lullabies in the walls, claiming the mirrors showed not one reflection but 7 faces standing together even when only one girl stood before them. The daughters never aged in rhythm with the seasons. At 12, they still looked 10, and at 15, their features remained untouched by time. Alistair's hair turned white, his hands shook when he raised a glass, but Eleanor remained unchanged, her face ageless, her eyes sharp as ever. It was said she spoke to the storm on their birthdays, walking barefoot into the rain, her white nightdress clinging to her as she whispered up into the lightning, welcoming whatever force had bound her bloodline to this cycle. By the autumn of 1847, the Ravenscroft name had become a warning whispered to children who strayed too far into the woods. The mansion's windows gleamed faintly at night, though no lamps were lit within. The 7 daughters would stand at the upper balcony, identical in form, their gowns pale against the dark. They watched the fields in silence, and sometimes villagers swore they saw their lips moving, not speaking but chanting together, their words swallowed by the wind. On the eve of their shared birthday, thunder always rolled without rain, and crows gathered in the hundreds, lining the fence posts like sentinels. The Ravenscroft family no longer attended church, no longer mingled with neighbours, and it was said that anyone who tried to count the girls' reflections in the glass would see more than 7 staring back, eyes endless, blue as ice, unblinking. The Ravenscroft estate sat like a wound upon the Kentucky hills, a mansion of black stone and tall brooding chimneys that exhaled no smoke. It was built generations earlier by the first of the Ravenscroft bloodline, but by 1853 it had already begun to show cracks in both its walls and its legacy. Beneath its grand staircases and velvet halls, the air held a chill that no fire could drive away, and the servants whispered that the house was sinking into something beneath it, something ancient and breathing. The land itself seemed uneasy, the trees bent slightly inward toward the manor, as if bowing to an unseen force. Local farmers spoke of odd hums that drifted across the fields at night, vibrations that rattled the glass and silenced the crickets, and each time one of the Ravenscroft daughters passed by in their matching white dresses, the dogs hid beneath porches and refused to emerge until morning. No one in the county could forget that all 7 daughters shared not only the same date of birth, but the same strange calm that marked their faces, the same rhythm in their movements, as though they were tethered to an invisible clock. When they were still children, it was easy to dismiss the oddities as the result of upbringing or isolation, but as they grew, the pattern became undeniable. They walked side by side in perfect sync, turning corners together, lifting teacups at the same instant, and sometimes one would stop mid-sentence, only for another to finish it without hesitation, their tone and pitch indistinguishable. The servants grew fearful, avoiding eye contact, and many refused to be in a room with more than one of them at once. Eleanor Ravenscroft, their mother, dismissed the rumours as ignorance, yet her expression betrayed knowledge she would never admit. The estate had been erected on land that locals believed cursed long before the Ravenscrofts arrived. Folklore said an ancient burial ground rested beneath the soil, belonging to a people who had vanished before Kentucky was mapped. Stones carved with symbols unlike any language known were sometimes unearthed by ploughs, only for those same stones to vanish again by morning. It was on this ground that Alistair Ravenscroft, in his ambition, had laid the foundation of his grand estate, convinced the old superstitions were nothing but tales of frightened settlers. But after the birth of the 7 daughters, the earth itself seemed to turn against him. The corn rotted before harvest, milk soured in the pails, and the wind carried a stench of iron whenever thunder rolled in the distance. When the daughters turned 13, the strangeness within the house deepened. The nights grew longer, the moon seemed perpetually half-hidden by clouds, and something began to stalk the edges of the property. The first signs were small, footprints leading nowhere, claw marks along the barn doors, candles that refused to stay lit in the chapel. Then came the disappearances. A farmhand vanished one night after boasting in town that he would spy through the Ravenscroft windows. They found his hat days later floating in the creek. torn and soaked through. But there was no body, no struggle, only a single strand of white fabric tangled in the reeds. The family buried an empty coffin, but whispers spread that the girls had been seen that same night in the field, standing in a circle beneath the lightning, their heads tilted back as if they were listening to something above them. Those who visited the estate after dark spoke of strange harmonies echoing through the hallways, as if the girls were singing in 7 tones at once. The sound didn't carry like music, but pulsed through the air like a vibration, crawling under the skin, making the chandeliers tremble. One guest, a traveling minister, tried to bless the home but fled halfway through his prayer, pale and shaking, claiming the very walls breathed in response to the psalms. The daughters watched him go from an upstairs window, their faces calm, unblinking, and when he looked back once before leaving the gates, he saw all 7 raise their hands in slow unison, as if waving goodbye, or perhaps casting something after him. Inside the home, the mirrors had been covered with black cloth ever since the twins, Clara and Rose, began to complain that their reflections were no longer following them. The family's maids whispered that if you looked into an uncovered mirror, you might see all 7 girls standing behind you, even if only one was in the room. The old butler, Mr. Greaves, was found dead in the parlour one evening, his eyes wide open, a mirror shard clenched in his palm, the edges of his lips curled into what could only be described as a smile of terror. After that, the remaining staff worked only by daylight, and at sunset they would lock themselves in the servants' quarters, refusing to answer any summons from upstairs. Alistair Ravenscroft grew reclusive, wandering his own home like a man lost in a maze. He stopped attending church and began to spend his nights in the library, surrounded by old books filled with symbols no one else could read. Some said he was searching for a way to undo what had been done. Others said he was protecting the rest of the world from his own bloodline. The daughters no longer seemed like children to him. They had become something else entirely, watchers, reflections of something deeper. He would catch them staring into the fireplace long after the embers had gone out, whispering softly in voices too low to decipher. He forbade them from entering the cellar, but one night he found the door unlocked, the stone steps damp with something dark and metallic. From that day forward, he kept the key on a chain around his neck, yet he could swear he heard footsteps descending when he lay awake at night. The villagers began to avoid the road that passed the estate, claiming the trees along its edges seemed to move when no wind blew. Travellers reported seeing faint blue lights flickering in the upper windows, drifting like candles floating underwater. On the 13th birthday of the daughters, a thunderstorm broke over the hills without warning, shaking the ground, tearing the trees from their roots. Those who lived near enough said the sky split open above the Ravenscroft estate, pouring light so bright it turned the rain white, and for one brief moment 7 shadows were seen standing on the roof, holding hands against the storm. When morning came, the sky was clear, the ground soaked with rain, and the entire house smelled of sulphur and roses. From that night on, no bird ever perched on the roof again, and even the crows flew wide around the property, as if some ancient sleeping force had awakened beneath the Ravenscroft land and claimed the daughters as its own. By 1860, the air around the Ravenscroft estate had grown heavier, as if the land itself had grown tired of holding the family's secret. The storms that once came and went now lingered for days, crawling across the hills with slow, deliberate thunder, and the crops that surrounded the property had long since stopped growing. Those who still lived nearby said the grass around the estate never grew past the length of a blade, as though the earth refused to feed anything tied to the Ravenscrofts. Inside the mansion, the light never seemed right. Candles flickered too slowly, shadows clung too long, and in every hallway there was the faint hum of something that was not quite silence. The 7 daughters had grown into young women, tall and pale, moving through the corridors like reflections of one another. They spoke less with each passing year, but when they did, their words carried the same rhythm, each voice blending into the others until it was impossible to tell who had spoken. It was on the eve of their shared 13th birthday that the first real terror took form. The servants, who were by then few, had gathered in the kitchen for warmth when the storm outside began to change. Instead of thunder, there was a sound like chanting carried through the rain, a deep chorus that seemed to come from beneath the ground. The wind howled down the chimneys, and for a brief moment the flames in the hearth turned blue. When one of the maids ran to shut the windows, She swore she saw 7 figures standing in the orchard, their nightgowns rippling in the storm, their faces turned toward the sky. None of them should have been outside, but when she called to them, they didn't move, didn't blink. By the time Alistair Ravenscroft rushed out with a lantern, the orchard was empty, the mud untouched, and the lantern's light revealed nothing but the trembling leaves. That night, the family locked all doors, and Eleanor whispered prayers into the dark, though her voice lacked conviction, as if she was pleading not to God, but to something else entirely. When morning came, the daughters were gone. Every bed was made, every window sealed from the inside, and no sign of a struggle could be found. The only sound left in the house was the ticking of a clock that had not worked in years, now beating steadily, 1 second behind the next, as if time had loosened its hold. The servants fled in panic, one breaking her ankle in her haste to reach the gates. The butler, who stayed behind long enough to inform the town sheriff, returned the next day with hair gone completely white and refused to speak of what he saw. He was found dead a week later in the churchyard, his hands clasped as if in prayer, but his eyes open, staring toward the east. Those who entered the estate after the disappearance reported that the air inside was still warm, the scent of roses thick in the parlor, and the family Bible lay open on the dining table, its pages burned at the edges, stopped at the book of Revelation. The words were scorched but legible, describing the opening of the 7th seal. The mirrors in the house were shattered, though no one could find the fragments. It was as if they had melted into the floors, leaving only black stains where they once hung. Eleanor Ravenscroft was discovered 2 days later, wandering barefoot through the fields, her gown soaked in dew, her eyes glassy and hollow. When the townspeople found her, she kept whispering, "They've gone back to where they belong," over and over, her voice calm, detached, as though her mind had followed them into whatever place they had vanished. For months afterward, strange occurrences plagued the area. Livestock were found mutilated but bloodless, their eyes wide open as if they had seen something in the night sky. The villagers claimed that during storms they could hear singing drifting from the direction of the Ravenscroft estate. 7 voices, harmonizing in a tone that made the hair on one's arm stand straight. Those who dared to get closer swore they saw light flickering in the upper windows of the long-abandoned mansion, though no fire could be seen. Only a faint, cold glow. On certain nights, when the wind blew just right, people said they could hear the front door creak open, followed by the soft tread of feet across the porch, as if the daughters had returned to walk the halls of their birth. The sheriff's men searched the property for weeks, digging near the orchard, exploring the cellars, even draining the small pond that shimmered at the back of the estate. They found no bodies, no clothing, no trace of the 7 girls. What they did find were 7 small stones buried in a perfect circle near the tree line, each engraved with a symbol no one could recognize. The stones pulsed faintly when touched, a vibration that sent fear crawling up the skin, and after a few days, they were gone, vanished as mysteriously as the girls themselves. The case was closed quietly, with no funerals held and no graves dug, only a silence that settled over the valley like a second skin. Over time, the Ravenscroft name became more myth than memory. Travelers passing through Kentucky told stories of a family cursed by their own ambition, of daughters who had been claimed by the same storm that had given them life. The old house became a ruin, its roof caved in, its walls crawling with ivy, but those who went too close came back changed, some unable to speak, others driven to madness. One traveler claimed that deep in the overgrown orchard he saw 7 shadows moving between the trees, each carrying a faint light that flickered like fireflies. When he turned to run, the air filled with the sound of laughter, not mocking, not cruel, but hollow and endless, as if time itself was laughing through their voices. Eleanor Ravenscroft disappeared soon after. Her shoes were found near the creek, her shawl snagged on a branch, but her body was never recovered. Some believed she went to join her daughters wherever they had gone, while others whispered that she had become something else, a guardian or a warden of whatever force had claimed her bloodline. After her disappearance, the Ravenscroft estate was left to rot, its doors chained shut by the county. Though every October storm was said to bring faint candlelight to its upper windows, no one dared to investigate. They said that if you stood on the hill during the first thunderclap, you could see 7 silhouettes behind the cracked glass, standing side by side, unmoving, watching the storm roll in, their faces pale and identical, waiting for the moment when the world would again remember the night they vanished from it. The legend of the Ravenscroft daughters did not fade when the house fell silent. It only deepened with each generation, sinking its roots into the soil of Kentucky like a sickness that refused to die. Long after the mansion was abandoned, travelers passing through the valley still felt uneasy when the wind carried a faint tune down from the hills. Locals said that if you stood near the gates on a moonless night, you could hear the faint sound of children humming, 7 distinct tones blending into one. It wasn't music, not truly. It was more like a vibration, an echo that seemed to move through the bones rather than the ears. The few who tried to enter the ruins came back changed, unable to speak of what they saw, their eyes hollow and glassy as if they had looked too long at something the human mind wasn't meant to understand. The mansion itself had become a living corpse, its structure twisting as though time within had folded over itself. The grand staircases were splintered, yet somehow the portraits still hung in perfect alignment on the cracked walls. The faces in the paintings seemed different each time someone looked, the brushstrokes shifting under the dust, the daughter's eyes following anyone who stepped too close. The mirrors that had once been covered were long shattered, but the shards that remained reflected images that didn't belong to the room. Flickers of candlelight in places where no flame burned, shapes of figures moving through the hall, though the air stood still. The brave few who trespassed spoke of a cold that did not come from the weather, a cold that moved, breathing softly against their necks as if unseen mouths whispered prayers or warnings into their ears. There were reports that the 7 girls had never truly left. On clear autumn nights, when fog clung to the orchard and the trees looked like skeletons, people swore they saw 7 figures standing at the upper window of the Ravenscroft house. Their faces were pale and indistinguishable, but their hair, long and dark, moved without wind. They were said to stand in silence until the clock struck 1, the same hour each of them had been born, and then vanish as the faint glow behind them died away. Farmers found that their cows refused to graze near the Ravenscroft fence line. Dogs barked at the air until they collapsed from exhaustion, and children who wandered too close came home sleepwalking, whispering words in languages no one could recognize. When historians tried to study the family's lineage, their records turned strange. Census lists showed the same birth dates repeated, but no death records were ever found. It was as if the daughters had been erased from history, but continued to leave footprints in the dust. The birth certificates, recovered from the county archives, were identical in handwriting, even though they had been signed by different midwives decades apart. The ink had not faded, the signatures perfectly preserved, and each one recorded the same hour and minute of birth, as though time itself had been forced to repeat. Stranger still were the medical notes that survived, descriptions of identical heartbeat rhythms between all 7 girls, matching down to the exact pattern, a steady pulse that had baffled every doctor who had examined them. Some speculated that the girls were the product of a rare genetic condition, others whispered of something older and darker, a soul divided 7 ways, destined never to rest. As the century turned, the Ravenscroft name became synonymous with curses. The few descendants who remained in Kentucky never spoke of their ancestors and often changed their surnames entirely. Yet, even those who carried the bloodline afar claimed that certain nights brought strange dreams, visions of a stormy sky, of 7 young women standing in a circle, holding hands beneath an ancient tree that no longer existed. One descendant, a woman living in Tennessee, reportedly woke with dirt beneath her fingernails and the faint sound of thunder in her ears, though the sky had been clear all night. Her account was one of many, written in the margins of family Bibles or hidden in drawers, stories that hinted that the Ravenscroft daughters had not died but had become bound to something that existed outside of time. The mansion itself resisted decay in unnatural ways. The wood refused to rot entirely, and ivy that grew over its walls never flowered. Inside, the dust settled evenly, undisturbed, as though the air itself were waiting. Paranormal investigators in the early 1900s attempted to document the property. They entered at noon, when the sun was high, but their equipment malfunctioned the moment they crossed the threshold. Cameras captured only blurred streaks of light, compasses spun without direction, and sound recordings played back whispers even when no one had spoken. One photograph, the only clear image taken inside, showed 7 faint outlines reflected in a cracked mirror behind the investigators, tall, slender figures with indistinct faces, standing shoulder to shoulder in the gloom. None of them had been visible at the time the photo was taken. As decades passed, stories of the Ravenscroft daughters became part of Kentucky folklore, told around campfires and whispered in churchyards. But those who lived closest to the ruins claimed the truth was no mere story. They spoke of storms that began without warning every October, of windows in the old manor that lit themselves with a cold blue glow, of footprints appearing freshly pressed into the dust, even though no one had entered the estate for years. The sound of laughter, soft, distant, but unmistakably that of young women, was heard echoing from the hills. Some said it was the daughters calling out to one another. Others believed they were calling for someone to take their place. There was one account that chilled even the skeptics. A hunter from a nearby town, lost in the fog one night, claimed to have stumbled upon the orchard behind the mansion. He said he saw 7 figures in white standing beneath the old oak, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark, their hands joined as they swayed slowly to music only they could hear. When one of them turned toward him, he swore her face was his own reflection. He ran without looking back, and when he reached town, the soles of his boots were covered in fine black ash. The following morning, a trail of faint footprints, 7 of them, led from the edge of the orchard to the gates, where they vanished into the earth. Over time, the county fenced off the property, calling it unsafe, though the true reason was never listed in records. No one dared to demolish it. Each attempt ended in sudden accidents or inexplicable fires, so the Ravenscroft mansion remained, a monument to something unholy and unsolved. Even now, when the autumn winds begin to rise and thunder rolls over the Kentucky hills, the people who live nearest the ruins lock their doors, draw their curtains, and pray under their breath that the storm will pass quickly. For on those nights, the light returns to the upper windows, and 7 faint silhouettes appear once more, watching silently from the shadows, their faces pale and their eyes faintly blue, waiting for the hour that had once bound them together forever. To this day, the story of the Ravenscroft family drifts like smoke through the valleys of Kentucky, carried in whispers that refuse to fade no matter how many years pass. The ruins of their estate remain standing, blackened by storms and half swallowed by vines, but no matter how much time wears away the stone, something within those walls still breathes. Travelers who wander too close to the old grounds claim the air grows colder the moment they cross the rusted gate, and the sound of their own heartbeat begins to echo faintly in their ears. They say the land itself feels watchful, that every creak of branch or rustle of leaf carries the suggestion of a presence that never left. The Ravenscroft mansion, once the grandest home in the county, now exists only as a silhouette against the horizon, its windows shattered and gaping like the eyes of a corpse. Yet when the October storms come, locals swear they see candlelight flicker behind the glass, moving from room to room, as though someone or something still roams the halls after all these years. The story that surrounds those flickering lights is older than memory now, passed down through generations who refuse to speak it aloud after dark. Some say the daughters were taken by something that answered their family's call, others that they had never truly been human to begin with. It is said the family's fortune was built not on land or labor, but on a bargain made in secret, one that required a promise to be renewed every generation. Each daughter, born on the same night, was both payment and offering, bound by a curse that was never meant to be broken. When the 7th was born, the circle was complete, and the power that had once sustained the Ravenscrofts finally came to collect what was owed. The night they vanished, the storm that tore across the valley was unlike any that had come before. Lightning without thunder, wind without direction, a silence between strikes so deep that it pressed into the skull. And when the storm passed, the Ravenscroft name vanished with it, leaving only a house and a legend that refused to die. Even now, the people who live near the estate tell of strange happenings that follow the bloodline. Descendants who carry even a hint of Ravenscroft heritage are said to be cursed with unbroken mirrors, flickering lamps, and sleepless nights. Some claim they see the 7 daughters in their dreams, standing in a circle with their faces hidden by veils of hair, their pale hands clasped, whispering the same words over and over. When these dreamers wake, they often find their clocks frozen at 1 o'clock, the hour the girls were all born. Historians have tried to explain it as folklore shaped by fear, but the county records themselves tell a different story. The births, the disappearances, the property records that ended abruptly after 1860 all align too perfectly. Each time someone has tried to rebuild or disturb the Ravenscroft grounds, storms roll in from nowhere, tearing down scaffolding, flooding the foundation, leaving workers injured or worse. The county eventually stopped granting permission to approach the land, leaving it to rot in silence. In the rare instances when someone ventures too close, the accounts are eerily similar. Visitors describe the sensation of being watched from the upper windows, even when the structure is clearly empty. Some hear footsteps following them along the path that leads to the front door, soft and measured, as though 7 pairs of bare feet were moving in rhythm behind them. The orchard that once bloomed behind the mansion still stands, though the trees bear no fruit. Their trunks twist like human forms, and the ground beneath them is soft, as though hollow. A few who have dared to enter speak of seeing faint figures between the trees when the fog rises, 7 shadows swaying gently, their heads bowed, their movements too smooth to be carried by wind. Local legend holds that on the eve of October 12th, the anniversary of the daughter's shared birthday, the Ravenscroft spirits returned to the place where their lives and their curse began. Those who live nearest to the valley have learned to leave offerings at the fence line, fresh flowers, mirrors turned face down, and candles left to burn until they snuff themselves out. The few who have ignored the old superstition often pay a strange price. Lights in their homes flicker in perfect rhythm, footsteps echo through their hallways at exactly 1 in the morning, and the faint smell of roses fills the air. In more than one case, witnesses claim to have found handprints on their windows, small and pale, arranged in a perfect line of 7. Some folklorists believe the curse was born from the soil itself. They say the land beneath the estate was once used for rituals long before settlers claimed it, a place where time and death blurred. The Ravenscrofts, in their hunger for wealth and power, may have bound their family to this ancient energy, and their daughters became vessels through which it would endure. Others insist that the 7 girls were not victims, but keepers of something the rest of the world was never meant to see. They vanished, not in fear, but in duty, to protect whatever force their family had awakened from consuming everything beyond their walls. Whatever truth hides beneath the legend, no one dares to find out. Every attempt to dig into the property ends the same way, with missing records, malfunctioning equipment, or sudden illness among those involved. It is as if the earth itself conspires to keep the past buried. Those who have lived long enough in the nearby towns can recount nights when the power goes out across the entire valley during storms. When this happens, they say you can see a faint blue light flickering on the distant hill where the mansion stands, followed by the faint sound of laughter, soft, childlike, carried on the wind. It begins low, almost gentle, but grows louder until it sounds like 7 voices overlapping, harmonizing in tones that twist the stomach. If you listen too long, they say the sound follows you home, echoing through your house long after the storm has passed. And so, the people of Kentucky avoid that hill. They build their homes far from the valley, and when travelers come asking about the old Ravenscroft place, the locals simply shake their heads and warn them not to linger after dark. Yet curiosity always returns, as it always does. There will always be someone drawn to the mystery, someone who believes they can uncover the truth behind the family's curse. They will climb the hill, step through the rusted gates, and vanish into the mist. And when the first thunder rolls across the valley that night, those who remain will look toward the mansion and see 7 silhouettes standing beneath the dead oak tree, their hands entwined, their eyes glowing faintly blue, waiting for the hour that binds them still.